Good afternoon. I am Lois Oliver, and I'm going to be reading several essays from a book called Stray Leaves, which is a compilation of a series of essays by John Hanson Mitchell. And Mitchell was born in New Jersey, but he's best known for a series of books that concentrate on a single square mile of land in eastern Massachusetts known as Scratch Flat. Anyway, he grew up in New Jersey, went to studied in Europe at the Sorbonne, but graduated from Columbia University with a degree in comparative literature. After a few jobs, he became a freelance writer and was hired by the Massachusetts Audubon Society in 1973 to edit their monthly journal. And these essays he wrote an essay in every issue, so these are a series of essays. And I'm going to start, for those of you, I don't know if anybody in here has a dog. I think I might need water. In any event, this essay is called The 5-Dog Night. Richard Porter of East Charleston, Vermont, age 79, does not own an electric blanket. He does not have central heat in his 3-room cabin, has not heard of modern airtight wood stoves, does not own a kerosene or gas space heater, and regularly allows the fire in his box-type wood stove to burn itself out each night around 11 o'clock. He is not averse to cold drafts, and for this reason has never insulated the pine boards that line his cabin, even though the temperatures in East Charleston commonly dip below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. And yet, in spite of his lack of conveniences, Porter says he is never cold at night. He has devised a system of living blankets that automatically pile themselves on his bed in response to the temperature. Porter is the type of mildly eccentric individual who can be found living beyond the confines of the rural towns throughout most of North America. He lives by his wits, working for logging crews when he needs money, picking over the local dump for resources he feels need recycling, and getting through the New England winter with as little expenditure of money and energy as possible. Like many who have deserted human society, Porter keeps a number of dogs for companions. Townspeople regularly see him walking the back roads surrounded by his pack, a mixed crew of all sizes and shapes, some large, some small, some friendly, and the rest too lazy to be unfriendly. Because of the companions, he has earned for himself the title, the Dog King, among the townspeople. Not surprisingly, it is his subjects that keep him warm at night. Each winter night, about the time the box stove begins to cool, the first of Porter's alternative heating system, a black and tan hound named Spike, begins to stir from his spot beneath the stove. Spike will climb onto Porter's bed when the room temperature reaches 50 degrees. Louise will get up around 40 degrees. Any colder, and the others begin to come through the dog door that Porter has cut in one of his door panels. Spike and Louise, his favorites, spend most of their time in the cabin. The others come in only to sleep and only when it's cold. They come in progression, Porter says. Jeff, a collie-like dog with a thick coat, will move in on those nights when the outside temperature reaches 10 degrees and will join the others on the bed shortly thereafter. Alice, a medium-sized dog of indeterminate parentage, arrives after the temperature dips below 10. But those nights when the mercury dips below zero, the zero mark, below the zero mark, the arrival of the warmest dog of all, an immense, golden-eyed thing named Bull, who has a strong shot of Irish wolfhound in his blood. Porter says that Bull does not normally appreciate such bourgeois comfort as warm stoves and human companionship, but in his aloof, dog-like way, he is as devoted to Porter as any dog of his type could be. Porter believes that it is generally below Bull to come in at night, let alone climb up on the bed with the lesser beings in the pack. But 0-degree nights get the better of the pride, and invariably he deserts his usual hideout beneath the porch stairs and squeezes in through the door panel. With Bull on the bed, there is not a single night that Porter cannot endure. Richard Porter has fallen behind the times in some areas of study. He believes, for example, that J. Edgar Hoover would have made a great president, is convinced that the Reagan administration was rife with communism, and it was not aware of the fact that this country experienced what was once termed an energy crisis. On the other hand, he has not been cold at night for 65 years, in spite of the fact that he lives in one of the coldest regions in New England and spends no more than $100 or $200 a year on energy, mostly dog food. So the next is called the Tree of Life. The kiwi, and I have no idea how you pronounce it, of New Guinea, like many pre-literate groups, have a great respect for trees. In the late 19th century, when they were first given iron axes by the British, they were reluctant to use them. And there were certain trees in particular that they refused to cut down. They believed, it was learned, that trees that were inhabited by entangina, or spirit beings, who were somehow connected with the soul of the tree. Before any tree could be felled, the axeman would have to request that the entangina move to another tree. And if his arms felt heavy while cutting, or if the work seemed particularly hard, it was a clear sign that the entangina had not yet deserted the tree, and it was perhaps best left standing. The Kiwi were not alone in their reverence for trees. Closer to home, our own European ancestors practiced various forms of tree worship, the best-known example of which is perhaps the religion of the Druids, who so revered the ancient oaks of the British Isles. But there were also sacred groves in what is now Uppsala, Sweden. The Slavs maintained holy forests where no tree could be cut. There were sacred groves throughout pre-Christian Germany, and perhaps most significant of all, according to Norse mythology, the very pivot of the earth was Yggdrasil, the world ash. Its limbs spread over the world, stood above the heavens, and its roots penetrated into the abyss of hell. Tree worship endured in Europe until the 14th century. The Lithuanians, the last convert to Christianity, had sacred groves around their villages. It was considered a sin to so much as break a twig from one of the trees there. It is little wonder that the trees and forests play such an important role in the spiritual life of pre-Christian Europe. In Roman times, all of Britain was forested with chestnuts, elms, and oaks. Germany was blanketed with dark, impenetrable woods. Northern Italy was treed with chestnuts and oaks, and the dark, fearsome Ciminian forest rolled south along the Italian peninsula all the way to Rome. Even the stark, late-flooded hills of Greece were once treed with oak and pine. though as early as the 5th century BCE, Plato lamented the deforestation of the archipelago. I know I can pronounce it. Nor was Europe alone. In fact, until some 10,000 years ago, when agriculture began to take hold as a way of life, most of the earth was covered with a green, sheltering mantle of trees. It is estimated that there were 15 or 16 billion acres of woods on the planet. Less than 1/3 of the great overarching forest remains. But quite apart from the fact that the human race must have grown up under the shade of the tree, there is something innately nurturing or good and beautiful about trees. There is no way that our pre-scientific ancestors could have known in a rational way, but trees and the existence of higher forms of life on this planet are inextricably connected. A single good-sized maple may contain several thousand green leaves, which can expose some 2,000 square yards, about half an acre, to the sky and the sun. These leaves take in the carbon dioxide from the air and hydrogen from the waters of the soil, combine the two with sunlight, and produce carbohydrates, which are capable of sustaining other forms of life. A growing tree uses carbon dioxide at the rate of 48 pounds per year, which comes to about 10 tons for every acre of forest. Every ton of new wood extracts about 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide and produces in return a little more than a ton of oxygen. If you consider that there are still about 10 billion acres of forest on Earth, that means that 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide are being used up each year by the forests of the world. Of course, carbon dioxide has become a problem in our time because of the destruction of the forest, because of human use of fossil fuels, and the increase in other gases. The dynamics of the Earth's atmosphere and its plant life are changing. And there is now too much carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. But as is often the case in world events, it is perhaps important to relearn what was known by our forebears. Trees are life, more than we know, and as the Kiwai made clear, we should perhaps be more careful when we go into the forest. This will take you back to your childhood. This is called Forgiven Trespasses. On any Saturday morning in May, the birdsong would come rolling into my bedroom from the surrounding hillside long before dawn. I'd be up by sunrise, roll my bicycle out of the garage, and be off for the wider world before the dew was dry on the grass. I was 10, and the backyards were large and brushy and worth finding out about. There was money in the town in which I grew up, but by the time all the old families had grown eccentric, their formal gardens had declined into a weedy patchwork, and frogs and salamanders had taken over their brick-lined swimming pools. Above the town, above the cliffs, along the cliffs above the river, the world was even wider. Here, in the 1920s, well-heeled stockbrokers had constructed large estates, most of which had been torn down or deserted after the crash. In the 6 miles of woods that ran along the cliff, there was rich picking for the unrestrained youths who ranged in the lower sections. Here, on any given Saturday morning in warm weather, we, the nomadic warriors of our neighborhood, would ascend. I remember it well. A mid-Atlantic forest of sweet gum and tulip with whisperings of gnatcatchers and cerulean warblers and the lure of ruins. One place in particular held our fancy. The estate was gone, but the pool with its pergolas and terraces and statuary was still there. Here we recreated the battles of history. Robin Hood and his band lurked in the surrounding greenwood to sally out and attack King John and his retinue. Here were Indians. Here we fought duels in the style of 3 musketeers among the moss-strewn statues in the shallow, rain-filled pool. This place, even at this distance in time, looms as a metaphor, a half-remembered country where the true tyrants of our world, parents, held no sway. There were other sites in town, old carriage houses long deserted. They had excellent burying grounds in the soil beneath the rotting wood floors. There were elaborate stairwells, narrow and worth fighting duels to defend. We found the bodies of rats and possums and raccoons in these old barns, and we sent the resident pigeons out in wild flurries. One building even had a barn owl. But this we avoided inasmuch as it was carefully guarded by someone's eccentric uncle. The town had streams and stone bridges into which large drainage pipes emptied. We had read or seen the movie Les Miserables with its famous sewer scenes, and these too we replayed periodically. We climbed down through grates, through narrow spots, and into larger conduits that fed to the bridge and brooks. It was here in this landscape that we learned the art of survival. It was here that I came to understand territory. Children, evil children from other parts of town, would occasionally sally forth and invade our grounds. So we recapitulated history and defended our land with sticks and showers of stones from one of the old barns where we maintained our Fortress America against the Nazis, the King's militia, marauding knights, pirates, renegade cowboys, bands of gangsters, and those myriad imaginary enemies that would assault our ground. We found nests. We caught frogs and put them into our mouths on a dare. We collected salamanders and put them in fish tanks to watch them grow. We brought home to nurse poor pigeons and English sparrows, along with baby rabbits, moles, and mice the cats carried in. Oscar the crow, who my brother rescued, lived with us for years, always fixing me with his glinty eye if ever I came near him when my brother was not around. There were no Boy Scouts in this tribe. There were no after-school programs. Saturday morning television held no attraction, and personal computers, to my eternal gratitude, had yet to be invented. We were bounded only by the wilderness of our imagination, but there are times when staring at the child-empty fields and woods around the town in which I now live, I wonder in what fields the children of this lost generation of wanderers play. And next we have a paradise of frogs. Years ago, I saw a photograph of Mark Twain in his summer whites, standing beside a frog pond with a cane pole fishing rod in his hands. It was his custom, I was told, to tie strips of meat to the end of a line and feed his bullfrogs for entertainment on summer afternoons. The image haunted me for years. The place where I now live was once a paradise of frogs. There was a fallen barn on the property and an old uncut lawn in back of the house with a few apple trees, backed by deep woods, complete with vernal pools. The yard early on was characterized mainly by amphibians. Wherever I walked, it seemed something cold-blooded was hopping out of the way. A toad, a wood frog, sometimes a green frog. I used to keep the pasture grasses down with a scythe, and nearly every other swing, sleek-bodied pickerel frogs would execute fantastic leaps to escape. I once found a gray tree frog in a hole in one of the old apple trees while I was out scything, and sometimes, after long rainy spells in spring, we would find frogs inside the very house, wood frogs in the cellar, spring peepers in the kitchen, and once a gray tree frog on the dining room window. Slowly, in the perhaps mistaken course of gentrification of these grounds, I began mowing the lawn and digging in the flower beds and cleaning up the fallen barn and assorted detritus that had collected since the old farmer who once owned the place went to his reward. The constant annual scything of the grasses under the apple trees finally evicted the poison ivy and the multiflora rose and the blackberry, but the pickerel frogs also departed. Toads no longer hopped out of the way on hot summer nights when you crossed the stone terrace in the back of the house, and I rarely saw any frogs on my lawn. What's worse, development began creeping into the former fields and woods around the house, and sadly, year by year, the spring peeper chorus diminished, and I heard less and less of the beautiful bird-like trilling of the gray tree frogs. Does everybody here know about the tree frogs here? They're loud. Part of this may have been a sign of the general worldwide decline in population, but I consider that at least on my property, it was probably all my handiwork, and that my cleaning up projects had forced them out. As a result, I decided to do something to try to bring them back. My first act was to dig a frog pond under the apple trees. It was just a shallow, scooped-up area that I lined with concrete. I dug the pond in March, let the concrete set, then filled it on a rainy day in early April. The next morning, I looked out from the back porch and saw a toad sitting on a rock. I had placed in the shallow end. Unfortunately, within a week, the frog pond began to drain itself. I filled it again, and it leaked once more. I bought sealer and painted the bottom to no avail, and in the end, I had to go out and buy one of those little pre-made fish ponds. To disguise its inherent ugliness, I gave this liner a skin coat of cement and then filled it. A week later, no fewer than 3 green frogs moved in. Inspired by this, I dug out another small pond farther from the house and put in another pre-made fish pond someone had given me. Within a few days, more green frogs took up residence, and at the end of summer, a fine pickerel frog settled there along with a fat bullfrog. I had no illusions that a single backyard frog pond, or for that matter, 10,000 backyard frog ponds spread out across the suburbs of America, would do anything to halt habitat destruction or the mysterious worldwide decline of frogs. The fact is that I like frogs. I like to have them around. My pond projects were not that much different from maintaining a backyard bird feeder. To further encourage my frogs, I stopped mowing grass with a lawnmower and resumed scything. With the poison ivy evicted from the grounds under the apple trees, I allowed the grasses to grow all season, save for 1 or 2 cuts, to keep the woody plants out. I let weeds take over former garden patches and allowed brush to grow along the back walls. I built several little tool sheds that were not necessarily for tools, but to serve as hiding places for mice and snakes and even for nesting birds, and a sanctuary for toads to hide under in the heat of the day. And finally, although it is not yet complete, I began digging out a larger, deeper frog pond just beyond the apple tree. My hope is that someday I will attract a permanent bullfrog population, and then, in summer, I shall dress in a white suit tie meat strips to a fishing line, and spend the rest of my days feeding frogs. So this is called, these are for bird lovers. You ready? The flight of the wren. On any given morning between May 5th and May 10th, I can step out in the garden and hear, for the first time in a year, the incessant, even frenetic trilling of the house wren. They come with a south wind, usually on a clear sunny morning, and go out with a far less flourish on the northwest wind 5 months later. The male is the first to arrive, and he goes around his land, which according to 21st century legal documents is actually my land, stating his ownership in no uncertain terms. He's been here before, and he knows his way around. The female arrives a few days later, and after a certain amount of ritual and restatements of territorial boundaries, none of which I can follow, she will begin work on a nest in a palatial birdhouse I have set up in the back of the garden. The two of them spend the spring and summer there, flitting around, getting angry, hunting through the shrubbery for spiders and caterpillars. Bird aficionados are not supposed to like wrens. They're noisy little devils for one thing, and they have some very nasty habits. Once they've crammed their bulky stick nests into whatever convenient crevice they can find, they range around their property, pecking the eggs of other nesting birds, almost out of spite, it would seem. Furthermore, they are not, how shall I say, the most beautiful bird in the backyard. They are patterned with a few dark stripes against a dull wood-colored brown background. Their belly is whitish, and they have a mean little decurved bill that looks like it was designed for surgical purposes. Nor are they loyal mates. Once they have set up housekeeping and the female is incubating the eggs, the male patrols his territory seeking other females. Given all this, they have not endeared themselves to those who seek wholesome metaphors from the world of birds. Even their semi-musical trilling becomes tedious when you hear it every minute or so throughout the daylight hours. In spite of all this, I am partial to wrens. I like their spunk. I like their cocky little tails and beady eyes and the way they get mad at anything in their path and begin whispering and chattering at cats and dogs and even people. But mostly what I like about wrens is their predestined willingness to take marathon flights from the cold gardens of New England and Canada, south to Florida, and even beyond into Central and South America. It seems unfathomable that these tiny packages can summon up the energy to fly all the way down a continent and back up in the course of a year, select mates, go about the business of raising children, only to turn around and go back south in autumn. Sometime in the summer, I don't know when exactly, since they slip out quietly, the wrens leave my garden. They fade from the sunny borders and move back into the shady woods, where they spend the late summer and early autumn feeding low to the ground, no longer singing, and assuming a certain hard-working, business-like effect. Perhaps they need to lay low in this manner. They have a long trip ahead of them. Although a few individuals may hang around the northern woods until November, most house wrens begin their mass exodus in September. Like many land birds, they move south in fits and starts, and like many migrants, they run into hardships along the way. Storms carry them far out to sea, headwinds batter them, cats eat them, and along with a growing number of birds nowadays, wrens crash into things at night. 50 years ago, these obstacles were radio towers, water towers, and skyscrapers. Now the birds have to contend with cell phone towers as well. Somehow, through all this, through pure atavistic drive and unstoppable wren energy, they make it. Wrens are not long-distance migrants in the manner of swifts and nighthawks, or even warblers and hummingbirds. They generally go only as far south as Florida. But it is that lack of limelight, that commonplace, dogged manner that I like about them. They're energetic little sparks of life in a hard rock world. I dare say they will never become extinct. So the last essay is called Lost in the Stars. On warm summer nights, when the smell of the river marshes below the house would fill the air and dusk has long faded out, we would sit on the front porch, watching the fireflies flashing in the hayfields to the west. My family, uncles, aunties, distant cousins, friends of cousins, cousins of friends of cousins, would sit and rock and talk about crops and dogs, horses, and hot weather. The air was thick then, and summer had its grip on us. Sometimes it seemed to me the very house would lift from its foundation at these hours and float suspended above the drying grasses in the fields to the north, where the corn rustled in the evening wind. On nights such as this, as the fireflies ascended, my old father would often reminisce about his years in the Orient, and as winking stars of light rose in the field below, he would tell us yet again the old Japanese folk tale of Princess Firefly, and recount stories of the traditional firefly festivals that took place all over Japan in his time. I was lost in the mystery of all this and would be swept into some vague, almost timeless suspension of disbelief. It all seemed so real, even though my father was telling the story of a firefly that was, in fact, a princess in a kingdom inhabited by insects. I was too young to know it was not true. And often on these hot nights, as children have done for thousands of years, my cousins and I would descend from the porch with kitchen jars and sweep the grasses, catching the flashers and carrying them around in the jars like mystic lanterns. Timing seemed everything to me, even then. Why did the fireflies flash at certain intervals? Why did they quit flashing periodically? And why did some of them never take to the air and perch low in the grass, emitting a long, sustained light? It was only later that I learned there was a dark side to the luminous display taking place in the fields, and that all the bright poetic legends and folk tales had an element of truth. Out there in the real world of the grassroot jungle, the lights that so inspired folk tales and festivals were in fact all about sex and death. Fireflies flash to attract mates, and it is for the most part the males that we see on summer nights. Shortly after they reach adulthood, usually around late June in New England, as dusk falls, the males launch themselves in the air and patrol to and fro across open areas, flashing a semaphoric signal to female fireflies who lie below watching. There are many as 30 different species of firefly in New England, and the males of each species have a set pattern of flashes which the female can recognize. Below in the grasses, the females spotting a potential mate light up with a sustained flash. The females who spot a potential mate light up with a sustained flash. The male blazes back, the female lights up again, and after a series of exchanges, the male descends to locate his mate. Sometimes more than one suitor will fly down, and the firefly princess will be surrounded by a company of suitors, each flashing handsome signals. But fireflies, it appears, are discreet denizens of this untamed, complex world. Once the couple has found each other, the lights go out and they mate. All is not love in the world of fireflies, however. There is also the question of sustenance. There is one species of firefly that makes use of the flashing repertoire of males to attain a meal. These carnivorous fireflies lie low in the grass and watch for the signals of other species of males flashing above. They imitate the flash pattern and draw the unsuspecting male down to his demise. But all that is science. When you're 10 years old and it is night and the sparkling stars of fireflies drift over the hayfield and the wind is in the corn, it is all a half-lit poetic mystery. So that concludes the reading for today.